This is Politics UK. I'm Charlotte Wright. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, in the budget, the Chancellor cuts 2p in the pound off national insurance contributions for working people.
We can now help families not just with temporary cost of living support, but with permanent cuts in taxation.
Britain in recession, the national credit card maxed out, and despite the measures today, the highest tax burden for 70 years.
The government's plan to send people who arrive in the UK illegally to Rwanda suffers 5 defeats in the House of Lords in a single day.
With respect to immigration, migration, refugees, asylum seekers, that there is a need for that to be dealt with. But let's do it in a way which is consistent with this country's proud tradition of the respect for law.
The bill is predicated on both Rwanda's and the United Kingdom's compliance with international law in the form of the treaty.
And Northern Ireland considers what to do about XL bully dogs following the ban in Scotland, England and Wales.
The overall population of these dogs remains low, especially when compared to other parts of the UK. However, I am conscious of our own capacity in Northern Ireland to receive unwanted dogs.
Well, the budget dominated the political landscape this week. After days of trails, leaks and speculation, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, stood up in the House of Commons on Wednesday afternoon to set out the government's financial plans for what remains of its term. Susan, what were the main headlines?
Well, we got a lot of them in advance, but although he spoke for more than an hour, he rather bookended it by the one great big political sign he wants all of us voters to take away, and that is that he is a tax-cutting Chancellor. So there were some crowd pleasers, like continuing the freeze on alcohol duty and on fuel duty, but there was also, as trailed in advance, that 2p cut in national insurance contributions, the tax that's paid by working people, on top of the 2p cut in national insurance that he announced back in November. Now, of course, tax cuts, they do have to be paid for, so how is he going to do that? Well, his announcement was that he was actually going to snaffle one of Labour's ideas, and that was the idea that they would end the tax breaks for wealthy foreigners who live some of the time here, what are called non-doms, and of course the Prime Minister's wife used to be one of those. So listen out for all the jeering and noise from Labour when he gets to that one.
We can now help families not just with temporary cost of living support, but with permanent cuts in taxation. We do this to give much needed help in challenging times, but also because Conservatives know lower taxes mean higher growth. Today, I've decided to extend the alcohol duty freeze until February 2025. This benefits 38,000 pubs across the UK. Lots of families and sole traders depend on their car. If I did nothing, fuel duty would increase by 13% this month. I have, as a result, decided to maintain the 5p cut and freeze fuel duty for another 12 months. This will save the average car driver £50 next year and bring total savings since the 5p cut was introduced to around £250. I will reduce the administrative and financial impact of VAT by increasing the VAT registration threshold from £85,000 to £90,000 from April the 1st, the first increase in 7 years. That will bring tens of thousands of businesses out of paying VAT altogether and encourage many more to invest and grow. To discourage non-smokers from taking up vaping, We're today confirming the introduction of an excise duty on vaping products from October 26 and publishing a consultation on its design. Because vapes can also play a positive role in helping people quit smoking, we'll introduce a one-off increase in tobacco duty at the same time to maintain the financial incentive to choose vaping over smoking. The government will abolish the current tax system for non-DOMs, get rid of the outdated concept of domicile, I aim to please all sides of the House in all my budgets. From this April, the high-income child benefit charge threshold will be raised from £50,000 to £60,000. We will raise the top of the taper, at which it's withdrawn, to £80,000. That means no one earning under £60,000 will pay the charge, taking 170,000 families out of paying it altogether. From April the 6th, employee national insurance will be cut by another 2p from 10% to 8%. And self-employed national insurance will be cut from 8% to 6%. It means an additional £450 a year for the average employee or £350 for someone self-employed. It is to unleash people power that we today put this country back on the path to lower taxes.
So that's the government's financial plan. What did the opposition make of it?
Well, you know, I may be very impressionable, but I always think when you listen to chancellors delivering their budgets, you get this lovely warm feeling that everything's great. And then the leader of the opposition gets up and suddenly it's like an icy cold blast. Everything's not so great. So Keir Starmer was saying that the economy is really not in very good health. And while he doesn't oppose those cuts in national insurance, he does say that, in fact, people are paying a great deal more tax. And that's because while people's salaries go up in line with inflation, indeed their grocery bills do too, the level at which they start paying tax has not gone up in line with it. So people are being dragged into higher tax bands.
There we have it, the last desperate act of a party that has failed. Britain in recession, the national credit card maxed out, and despite the measures today, the highest tax burden for 70 years. The first Parliament since records began to see living standards fall, confirmed by this budget today. That is their record. It is still their record. Give with one hand and take even more with the other. And nothing they do between now and the election will change that. I mean, over 14 years, we've seen our fair share of delusion from the party opposite. A Prime Minister who thinks the cost of living crisis is starting to ease. An Education Secretary who thinks concrete crumbling on our children deserves her gratitude. A former Prime Minister who still believes crashing the pound was the right path for Britain.
Where is she?
And today, a new entry in this hall of infamy, the Chancellor, who breezes into this chamber in a recession and tells the working people of this country that everything's on track. We will support the cuts to national insurance today. But I noticed this. In 2022, when the Prime Minister was Chancellor, he made this promise. I can confirm in 2024, for the first time, the basic rate of income tax will be cut from 20 to 19 pence. Having briefed that all week that an income catch was coming, that promise is in tatters today.
People in Scotland needed a budget that delivered funding that would have allowed investment for our public services, real investment in the NHS that supports families, a budget that supports families with the cost of living taken into account and properly invests in green energy, not another austerity Chancellor taking an even bigger axe to investment than his predecessors.
What we heard from the Chancellor was a budget that reeks of desperation and deceit, from a government that knows it's lost the trust of the British people. A bottom-of-the-barrel budget, nothing to make families truly better off after the catastrophic fall in living standards we've seen under the Conservatives.
Some pretty scathing responses to the budget there. Thank you, Susan. We'll come back to you again shortly. Let's go to Edinburgh now, though, and our Scotland political correspondent Andrew Kerr, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Andrew, the UK government's budget included an extension to the windfall tax on oil and gas in Scotland because of continued high oil prices. How did that go down?
Well, Charlotte, it's been a huge week at Westminster with the budget and a hugely embarrassing week here at Holyrood for the Scottish Conservative Party, because their leader Douglas Ross was saying he was disappointed that the windfall tax had been extended for another year. It was their spring party conference in Aberdeen last weekend, and the whole theme of the conference had been protecting North Sea oil and gas workers. So the party had even organised a debate on Budget Day here at Holyrood in the Chamber, and it was just a little bit awkward for them.
The Scottish Conservatives remain the only party that believes in the contribution this sector makes to our economy and has committed to supporting it for a long time to come. Yes, please, I will.
Kevin Stewart.
I wonder if Mr Lumsden would care to comment on the extension of the windfall tax on the oil and gas industry, which will damage the northeast of Scotland, and how is he going to respond to his Tory masters in London to get shot of it?
Douglas Lumsden.
Well, Presiding Officer, I'll gladly respond to Kevin Stewart, because yes, I'm disappointed that the windfall tax has been extended, but let's have a think at what the other parties are doing. The SNP, for example, they're in favour of a windfall tax. But more than that, they have a presumption against oil and gas that would devastate the oil and gas industry.
Since he's so keen on economic growth, what does it say about his government's performance that we've had 7 quarters of decline in GDP per head? And why was it that the last auction round we had no one competing for offshore? What does that say about your economic record and your credibility on renewables?
We need to speak through the chair. Douglas Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, I'll come on to GVA later, because I'm going to highlight the importance of the oil and gas industry, something that the Labour Party would turn its back on and turn off the taps.
Now, unsurprisingly, the Conservative leader Douglas Ross didn't pick up on this issue at First Minister's questions. Instead, he focused on health. But the First Minister, Hamza Yousaf, took great delight in the Conservatives' misfortune in a session that was disrupted multiple times by protesters in the public gallery.
OK, and the Scottish Government have released another paper on independence proposals, setting out what they see as Scotland's place on the international stage. And that's caused a bit of controversy too, hasn't it?
Yes, that's right. We've had a series of these papers about how an independent Scotland would operate. And this week saw a paper in particular on how the Scottish Defence Forces would work. Now, the Scottish Government want to remove nuclear weapons from an independent Scotland as quickly as possible, but they say that would not prevent them from joining NATO. So this paper was being debated in the Chamber at Holyrood earlier in the week, and Labour were keen to find out how this nuclear-free option might operate under NATO's nuclear umbrella.
Is the Scottish Government saying they would allow NATO nuclear assets into Scottish waters and onto Scottish land, yes or no? Does the Cabinet Secretary want to make clear to the United States, to France, to the rest of the UK, that their nuclear fleet would be banned from Faslane or not? I'm happy to give intervention.
Cabinet Secretary. And thank you for Neil Bibby for giving way. What he's outlined is the position of the government of the Kingdom of Denmark, the government of the Kingdom of Norway, of Sweden, and the Republic of Finland. If it's all right for them, why is it impossible for Scotland?
Neil Bibby, give you the time. Talk about not answering the question. I didn't ask about Denmark, Finland, or Norway. I asked about the Scottish Government's position that whether the Scottish Government would allow NATO nuclear assets into Scottish waters or lands. I'm happy to take another intervention.
I am.
Cabinet Secretary were to answer that direct point. Are you saying you would forbid NATO nuclear assets from entering Scottish waters or land?
Cabinet Secretary. As Neil Bibby should know, the right of passage for any vessel, conventional or nuclear, armed or powered, is guaranteed under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. That's a statement of fact.
Neil Bibby.
Well, I think the Cabinet Secretary's position is extremely confusing.
Now, the Cabinet Secretary was adding that being nuclear-free was entirely consistent with NATO membership, saying that 23 out of 31 members neither possess nor host nuclear weapons on their soil. Now, this debate will continue, of course, in particular the debates about the Scottish Government independence papers, because opponents here are saying, of course, there is no current prospect of Scottish independence itself.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that then. And a new bill has been introduced in the Scottish Parliament to put in place buffer zones around abortion clinics to prevent protests. What's been happening there?
Yes, so these buffer zones would be 200 metres around these abortion clinics to crack down on protests at the moment. Now, on Tuesday, Holyrood's Health Committee were hearing from frontline practitioners and police who will be involved in this as well. Last week, MSPs were hearing from women who'd been targeted by these protesters, and next week we'll be hearing from those who are opposed to these zones being put in place. So the Green MSP, Ross Greer, was asking the police about their current powers, but first of all, let's hear about this current situation from two frontline practitioners.
Prior to abortion being legalised in 1967, it was a leading cause of maternal death, and it's not anymore. And particularly with the advent of medical abortion and good access and women being able to have access to medical abortion at very early stages of pregnancy, it's an extremely safe procedure. The WHO say it's essential healthcare. We need to protect access to this essential service.
We wouldn't expect people who were coming in for hip operations, for example, to be taken in through a back door, as you say. So why should we expect anyone entering any sort of healthcare establishment for any access to services not to come in the area that you'd expected the public to walk into? Because it gives the whole connotations around abortion services if you're going round through the back door.
Those who've complained about protesters to the police in the past, the response that they've received is that there is no current law on the books that they are breaching, and therefore your officers are unable to take enforcement action unless very specific behaviours cross a line.
When there's protest, when it's actually happening, and there's specific behaviours taking place, then yeah, we do have the legislation at that point to deal with that protest. But I would say what we don't have at the moment is legislation around that preventative element to create that safe space and for us to, I suppose, enforce that safe space.
Now, as I mentioned, the committee is taking a balanced approach on this, and they will hear from people who are against the buffer zones next week. In fact, during this period of Lent, there's a group called 40 Days for Life that has stepped up their prayer vigil outside clinics. But with that said, the bill continues its process through Parliament at the moment. Charlotte.
OK, Andrew Kerr at Holyrood, thank you very much for the update. Let's go back to Westminster now and to our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. And Susan, we were talking a little earlier about the budget. Just before that budget statement was Prime Minister's questions, and they avoided giving any spoilers on the budget, didn't they? What did the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, choose to go on instead?
Yeah, well, you're right. There's not much point talking about the budget right before you have the budget. But, of course, it is Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, who has to respond to both the budget and do Prime Minister's questions all over lunchtime, 2 or 3 hours of it. So let's hope he had the porridge as well as the eggs before he came to work. Now, the previous week, it had been a very noisy, quite aggressive, very political sort of session. The mood was very, very different this week. The SNP leader did ask about that windfall tax on oil and gas, which we heard about in Holyrood there. But Keir Starmer decided to go on something quite different. He asked about the worrying findings in the first report by Lady Ailish Angelini into the murder of Sarah Everard.
3 years ago, Sarah Everard was walking home when she was abducted and murdered by a serving police officer who should have been trusted to keep her safe. Yeah. Lady Angelina's report exposes the appalling failure in police vetting and in misconduct processes, and I'm very troubled by its conclusion that there is, and I'm going to quote it, nothing to stop another cousins operating in plain sight. How can that be the case 3 years on from this horrendous crime?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I firstly say that I'm sure all members of the House will have been thinking about Sarah Everard in recent weeks. It was, as the Honourable Gentleman said, an absolutely shocking case, and the abuse of power in particular was appalling. That's why we took action quickly, Mr. Speaker, to strengthen police vetting, strengthen the rules for rooting out officers who are not fit to serve, and conducted the largest ever screening of all serving officers and staff. We're now ensuring that any officer who has been charged for a crime will be suspended from duty automatically until their case is concluded, and we will thoroughly consider all of the report's recommendations and respond in full.
Serious failures in police vetting were raised in independent reports as long ago as 2012, 2019, 2022 and 2023. And that's why Labour's been arguing for mandatory national vetting standards, which would stop anybody with a history of domestic abuse or sexual offending being allowed to join the police in the first place. Why are mandatory national vetting standards not already in place?
The College of Policing has updated its existing statutory code on vetting, and that happened quickly. And in addition, the Policing Inspectorate, Mr. Speaker, carried out a rapid inspection of all forces' progress against the previous findings. And in addition to that, an entire check against the National Police Database was carried out for all serving officers and staff.
The Angelina report recommends reviewing all indecent exposure allegations against serving officers in order to identify, investigate and remove those officers from service. Now, given the obvious urgency of this recommendation, can the Prime Minister give a categorical assurance that it will be implemented immediately?
Indecent exposure, just like any other kind of sexually motivated crime, is abhorrent, and we expect police chiefs to take it extremely seriously. We fully expect police chiefs to suspend an officer charged with any kind of sexually motivated crime.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
The Conservative Party want to use Scotland's natural resources to pay for tax cuts in England. The Labour Party want to use Scotland's natural resources to pay for nuclear power stations in England, and the cost of that up to 100,000 jobs. Scotland's wealth, Scotland's resources, Scotland's jobs, all a game to Westminster. But with the Tories on just 15% in the polls in Scotland now, will the Prime Minister do us all a favour and call a general election?
He talks about tax in Scotland and England. I'll just gently point out to him that thanks to the actions of the Chancellor and this UK government, everyone in Scotland has received a significant tax cut from January this year. And in contrast to the Chancellor's last budget, the SNP's budget put taxes up for working Scots. Scotland is now the high tax capital of the UK, but this Conservative government is going to keep cutting taxes for hard-working Scots.
That's Prime Minister's questions there. Thank you very much, Susan. We'll come back to you again a little later in the programme. Let's go to Cardiff now, though, to our Wales political reporter, Tulare Glyn-Jones, who's at the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd. Tulare, the row over releasing Welsh Government WhatsApp messages from the COVID pandemic continued this week. What's the latest on that?
Yes, absolutely. The UK COVID inquiry has been going through its Welsh module in Cardiff over the last 2 weeks, and there's still a week to go. There have been revelations about WhatsApp messages being deleted by ministers and civil servants early on in the pandemic, but the Welsh Government insists that no major decisions were made over the messaging service. Welsh ministers aren't due to give evidence until next week and have so far refused to answer any questions on the pandemic in anticipation of the inquiry, they say out of respect for Lady Hallett's inquiry. But when both political parties questioned the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, on the evidence already submitted and in the public domain this week at FMQs, he refused to answer.
Can you confirm whether you do use WhatsApp regularly as the evidence that was put to the COVID inquiry last week, in particular when it comes to policy and rule decisions?
I am a witness at the COVID inquiry. I will answer their questions, whatever points they put to me. I am not going to offer a preview of what I say.
Can I seek your support, Presiding Officer, because surely Parliament deserves greater respect than that?
The First Minister is responsible for the content of his own answers, and that's not a matter for me.
What we're hearing, of course, is only scratching the surface. All of this tells me that denying Wales its own inquiry, as we on these benches have called for, from the early days of the pandemic, has been a serious error of judgment by the First Minister and his government.
Those calls for a Welsh COVID inquiry growing ever louder here in the Senedd. Now, the presiding officer said there would be an opportunity after the inquiry at FMQs to scrutinise the First Minister and his evidence. But that will, of course, be Mark Drakeford's final appearance at FMQs before he stands down. So the time for scrutiny is running out.
Interesting. And there have been discussions about increasing the size of the Welsh Parliament. What are the reasons behind that?
Yes, they have been controversial. It's a plan that would see the number of politicians here increase from 60 to 96 at a cost of up to £20 million a year. It would see a closed list system whereby a party's name will appear on the ballot and not a named politician. And political parties would choose the candidate, something that many feel will lead to an erosion of that direct link between the electorate and a named individual representing them. The reforms are supported by Plaid Cymru as part of their cooperation agreement with the Welsh Labour government, but they were challenged this week in that debate by the Welsh Liberal Democrat member and the Welsh Conservatives for their support of this closed list system.
Wales does not need more politicians. We need more doctors and dentists. We don't need more government ministers. We need more nurses and teachers. And we don't need political parties in the Senedd putting their energies into closed candidate lists. We need to get to grips with NHS waiting lists, poor education standards and light pay packets.
I wonder if your party have challenged Labour as to why they are sticking to closed lists and why that's putting you in the position of only supporting that. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Dro ar ôl tro heb os.
I don't think I'm sharing any secrets there. It's been clear that Plaid Cymru's stance is STV, but what we have is a pragmatic way forward. But certainly, their decision has been challenged time and time again.
Now, with Plaid Cymru's support, the bill passed on to its third reading, although it did become clear throughout the debate that the legislation is a compromise in order to get the backing of some backbench Labour MPs and Plaid Cymru in time for the 2026 election. But there is widespread acknowledgement that the proposed new system isn't perfect.
Now, the Senedd has also been looking into its procedures for suspending or getting rid of members who behave badly or commit offences. Why is that?
Yes, under the current constitutional situation, there's no mechanism for a recall if, for example, they behave badly or break the law. Darren Miller, who we've already heard from, tabled this amendment calling for a recall mechanism similar to the one we see in Westminster, where if a politician breaks the law or is sanctioned to more than 10 days suspension by the Standards Committee in the Senate's case, they'd be subject to a recall petition, and if 10% of the electorate sign that petition, then a by-election would be triggered.
Why a by-election rather than filling the vacancy with a list candidate? Well, for two reasons. Firstly, because of legal reasons in relation to human rights, an MS who has been the subject of a recall petition cannot be prevented from the opportunity to fill a vacancy that is then created. So they must have the ability to be able to stand an election following a successful petition to remove them from office, because, of course, only 10% of that electorate will have been able to express an opinion through the recall petition process. And the second reason not to simply fill a vacancy created by a recall petition by the next candidate on a list is because, as we have seen with the recall system for MPs, members of the public rarely want to be represented by an MP of the same political party in a by-election following a recall.
Now, the Counsel General, Mick Antoniv, rejected the amendment. It didn't pass, saying it's not straightforward. It's not a straightforward matter to be dealt with in an amendment at such short notice. But he asked the Standards Committee to look into how this can be done. And this week, these issues have really been put into sharp relief here in the Senedd, because a Plaid Cymru member of the Senedd, Rhys Bowen, has been sanctioned to the longest ever sanction by the Standards Committee for groping and swearing at women while very drunk on a night out. He's been suspended for 42 sitting days, if that's approved by the Senedd next week. There's currently no mechanism for him to be recalled, despite the serious nature of the allegations against him. There's a widely held feeling that the current system across all parties doesn't do a good enough job of ensuring the integrity of elected members or giving the electorate the choice of who represents them. But it remains to be seen whether the Standards Committee can come up with a way to figure out the logistics of how that will happen. So there is a will, but can they find a way of doing it in time for this legislation and the next Senedd election in 2026?
OK, Tulare Glyn Jones in Cardiff Bay, thank you very much for the update. Well, let's go to Northern Ireland now and to our political reporter Jim Fitzpatrick at Stormont. Jim, under the rules of the Northern Ireland Assembly, the opposition gets to set the agenda for one day every month. This week saw the first opposition day since devolution was restored. How did it go?
Yes, this was the treat, if you like, for the SDLP, who are now the official opposition here at Stormont. And that party has promised to play a constructive role in opposition in challenging the four parties of executive government here in Northern Ireland. We shall see how that goes, and that doesn't mean that they're going to go soft. So in their sights this week were the two big parties of executive, that's the DUP and Sinn Féin, and that's because those two parties on different occasions, Sinn Féin in 2017 and then the DUP in 2022, have both collapsed government and the institutions here by walking out of the executive. If either of those two big parties leave, then government collapses regardless of what the other parties want to do. And what the SDLP did was put down a motion which asked for an apology and a promise that neither of those two parties would do it again. Well, perhaps not surprisingly, they didn't win the support of the two big parties. In fact, neither the First nor the Deputy First Minister showed up for the beginning of the Opposition Day debates. However, they did win over the other two smaller parties of government. The SDLP's Matthew O'Toole, the leader of the opposition, said that this sort of Damocles hanging over Stormont government, this veto, was a problem, and it meant that that potential instability made it difficult to deal properly with central government at Westminster.
One of the reasons why the Treasury and this Tory government have been able to be so cynical in their treatment of these institutions and politicians here has been because of the repeated cycle of collapse. In order to build not just credibility with the public, in order to reinforce our ability to negotiate with the UK government and others, we need to have sustainable political institutions and not institutions that collapse so routinely. So, as I said, a Tory Secretary of State working out his notice will not do the work for us. We need to do it ourselves, starting with these Opposition Day motions. Let's protect, I will give way in my wine speech, I'm happy to give way to anyone who didn't get in at this stage. Let's protect the best of the agreement and reform the veto that's undermining trust in the rest of it. The photo ops and positive vibes of the past month have been welcome. But we've seen this movie before, and rather than wait for the nasty plot turn and not-so-shock ending, let's change the script. Let's never again plunge our public services and our people into the vortex of no government and no hope.
Shame on you, shame on your party for the impact that that has had on our public sector. We have seen a decline in that, and for you to hold the whole country to ransom over your party issue is absolutely shameful, and we will feel the effects of this for generations to come.
What I found bizarre in this motion, when looking at the impacts on our public services and the cause and effects, there's no mention at all of the British Tory government and their regressive policies.
Why, Deputy First Minister, will you not commit to staying in your job for the rest of the mandate, given the seriousness of all the issues you've been discussing for the last half hour?
The best way to secure and stabilise the future of our government here in Northern Ireland is to build those constructive working relationships. We work within the framework as set down by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, as amended by St Andrews.
Emma Little-Pengelly there, the Deputy First Minister of the DUP. So that SDLP motion was defeated, 47 votes to 33. That means that both the DUP and Sinn Féin still have the power to collapse the institutions here, should they so wish, if they walked out of government at any moment.
OK, now, Jim, we've covered the banning of XL bully dogs in previous programmes, first in England and Wales, then in Scotland. Now a minister has delivered a statement on the topic in Northern Ireland. What did he say?
Yes, this is the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Minister. It's now Northern Ireland's time to catch up. So what the Minister did was announce new rules for XL bullies here in Northern Ireland. It will mean that the dogs will have to be on a muzzle and on a lead when in public. It also means that owners will have to get an exemption certificate for those dogs. And most crucially, perhaps, it means that the breeding and the selling of the dogs will now be banned, such as it is in the rest of the UK. The Minister said the measures were proportionate to the numbers of dogs here in Northern Ireland.
I do not wish to scaremonger. I will remain grounded in the facts. The overall population of these dogs remains low, especially when compared to other parts of the UK. However, I am conscious of our own capacity in Northern Ireland to receive unwanted dogs, nor do I want to expose the public to an exacerbated level of risk. I have been advised that there are 140 XL bully dogs licensed right now, up from around 90 last October. Therefore, it is time to act. Whilst numbers remain manageable, and we can, in the main, track where these dogs are, I want to reassure members of this House and the people of Northern Ireland that I have not rushed into a decision. I have carefully considered all aspects and have not taken this decision lightly. I'm also aware that I cannot delay acting any further.
Andrew Muir there revealing that the numbers here of XL bully dogs are relatively low, but they have been ticking up, perhaps because of displacement of dogs moving from the rest of the UK to Northern Ireland. So we shall see whether those numbers now stabilise with these new rules. That's certainly the intention.
We shall see. Jim Fitzpatrick, thank you very much for bringing us up to date with events at Stormont. Let's go back to Westminster now, and a topic, Susan, that we've talked about a lot recently, the government's plan to send people who arrive here on small boats to Rwanda. The bill suffered 5 defeats in the House of Lords in one day this week, didn't it? There is clearly a lot of hostility to the plan in the upper chamber. Do you think that will affect the government's plan to make it law?
Yeah, well, in fact, there were 10 defeats in 2 days, as it turned out. But, yeah, I mean, I think the government can get its Safety of Rwanda bill, because once the Lords has finished with it, it goes back to the House of Commons and the government can get Conservative MPs to overturn any changes that the Lords have made to it. There's always a bit of back and forward of a bill between the two houses, though in the end, the Lords usually back down and let the elected Commons have its way in the end. But just before we listen to these debates, just a quick reminder of what it's all about and why so many peers, including some Conservative ones, are very unhappy about this bill. So the Supreme Court said last autumn that we couldn't be sure that refugees would be safe if they were sent to Rwanda. And so sending them there would break UK and international law, where we've made agreements on how refugees should be treated. The government's answer to that has been the Safety of Rwanda bill, which just states that Rwanda is safe and the courts have to accept that. And they say that that's underpinned by a new treaty that they've struck with Rwanda, that there are agreements on the way refugees will be treated there. But that's not really satisfied a lot of peers who say, well, you can't just say something is a fact if it's not true.
By writing into law a demonstrably false statement that Rwanda is a safe country to receive asylum seekers, and thereby forcing all courts to treat Rwanda as a safe country despite clear findings of fact. It's clear, my lords, that the bill subverts the rule of law.
It is absolutely critical that domestic and international law is complied with, and this should not be up for debate. It's who we are. It's what we stand for. And if we seek to deviate from our domestic and international legal obligations, our role on the world stage and our ability to have influence globally is significantly diminished. We cannot shy away from the consequential impact this will have on other countries choosing to follow suit.
I suggest to your lordships that in resolving to decide this issue for itself, the Supreme Court was trespassing on the province of the executive. And if there is any breach of the principle of separation of powers in this matter, it is not the government which is guilty, it is the Supreme Court.
I think it's a mess of a bill, and it's illegal and it's nonsensical, and we, your Lordship's House, is being asked to actually indulge in pointless chatter for the whole day and for another day, and it's pointless chatter because whatever we say, the government will not listen to us.
This bill is solely about asserting a fact to be a fact, regardless of any evidence and regardless of the fact that the Supreme Court judges, 5 of them, unanimously considered that evidence and came to the conclusion, which isn't too surprising, that Rwanda is not a safe country.
As I understand it, the rule of law in this country for 1,000 years has meant that laws made and approved by our elected representatives are impartially implemented by the courts, and all of us, citizens, public officials, ministers, police, even lawyers and bishops, are subject to those laws. But if we don't like the law, we can try to persuade our elected representatives to change it.
What we would wish to do is to see the challenge of the small boats and the challenge that we see in our country with respect to immigration, migration, refugees, asylum seekers, that there is a need for that to be dealt with. But let's do it in a way which is consistent with this country's proud tradition of the respect for law, both our own domestic law, the separation of powers, but also with respect to the international laws based on treaties we signed as a free, independent country.
I cannot accept that the provisions in this bill undermine the rule of law. Amendment 2, that this legislation is not compliant with the rule of law, is simply not right. My Lords, the bill is predicated on both Rwanda's and the United Kingdom's compliance with international law in the form of the treaty, which itself reflects the international legal obligations of the United Kingdom and Rwanda.
Well, that's the Rwanda bill in the Lords there. Just before we go, Susan, what are we expecting in Parliament next week?
OK, well, more Rwanda, more budget debate. One other thing that caught my eye, though, the Home Affairs Committee is looking at whether some asylum seekers are claiming that they've converted to Christianity to improve their chances of being allowed to stay in the UK. And that was something that was raised in the case of Abdul Ezedi, who, if you remember, carried out that dreadful corrosive fluid attack in Clapham. And MPs are questioning church leaders and a Home Office minister about that.
Oh, that'll be something very interesting to watch closely. All right, thank you very much, Susan. That's all we've got time for this week. Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and on iPlayer. But in the meantime, have a great weekend. Bye for now.